I saw him through the front window before I even killed the engine. He was standing in my parents' kitchen, one hand on the counter, like he belonged there. Late 50s, maybe early 60s. Broad shoulders, gray jacket. He turned slightly and the lake light flashed across his face. Not a contractor, not family. Not anyone I had ever seen before. For a second, I just sat there with my hand frozen on the steering wheel. The gravel under my tires clicked as the SUV settled. The house was finished, the flowers were planted. The porch swing was up in less than an hour. I was supposed to bring my parents here for their 40th anniversary and hand them the keys to the one thing they had never asked me for. And now a stranger was inside. Then he disappeared deeper into the house. My chest went cold. The place stood at the edge of the water exactly the way I had imagined it for years. Maybe better. Soft gray siding, black framed windows, warm cedar posts. Even from the driveway, you could see the morning room catching the lake like a mirror. It looked calm, peaceful, finished, like the kind of place people spent decades hoping for. But all I could think was one brutal question. How did he get in? I opened the car door and stepped out into that sharp lake wind that always smelled like wet stone and pine. A ribbon from one of the anniversary boxes in the back seat fluttered against the doorframe. I had a cake in a cooler, a bottle of wine my father once said was too expensive to waste on ordinary days. I had a folder with the deed inside. I had spent $325,000 building that house in secret, and someone else was walking around in it. I started toward the front steps, then stopped halfway up the path. The curtains moved, not from the breeze, from a hand. He was watching me now. That was the moment everything changed. Until then, this day had one shape in my mind. My mother crying at the view. My father going silent in that way he did when he was hit too hard to speak. Maybe a laugh, maybe disbelief, maybe all three. I had built this house to give them something they had postponed their whole lives. Rest, beauty, a place that asked nothing from them after decades of giving everything away. Instead, I was standing in front of my own surprise, trying to decide whether I was about to confront a trespasser, a scammer, or a mistake so big it could ruin the whole thing. The front door was closed, but not all the way. Just enough to show a thin, dark line at the frame. I knew I had locked it 2 nights earlier after the final staging walkthrough. I remembered checking the brass handle twice. I remembered standing on the porch afterward, exhausted, staring at the water while the electrician's van pulled away. For the first time in years, the plan had felt real, complete. Now the door was cracked open, like the house had taken one breath too many. I climbed the steps slowly. The wood gave a soft new creak under my shoes. Inside, I heard movement. Not frantic, not clumsy, calm movement. A drawer sliding, a footstep, then silence again. I pushed the door wider. Hello? My voice landed awkwardly in the empty foyer and traveled down the hallway toward the great room. The whole house still smelled new. Fresh cut trim, paint, oak flooring warmed by sunlight. On the entry table sat the framed black and white photo I had placed there myself the night before. A picture of my parents at 23, standing beside a rusted sedan with my mother leaning into my father's shoulder. They looked young and broke and certain. That photograph was the point of all of this. Not the square footage, not the price tag, not the lakefront address. Them, people like my parents, never said they wanted big things. They said things like, "We're fine." They said, "Maybe one day." They said it while patching old roofs, reusing coffee cans for nails, and driving cars until the doors rattled. They built a life the slow way. Honest work, missed vacations, hand-me-down furniture, overtime hours, every comfort postponed so their kids could step into rooms they never had. I had spent years trying to think of the right way to thank them, and every idea felt small. Watches felt small. Trips felt small. Checks felt insulting. None of it matched the scale of what they had given me. Not money, not really. Something harder to repay. Stability, loyalty, safety, the kind of love that keeps showing up in work boots and tired eyes. That is why the house existed. A lake house was never just a house to them. It was the dream hidden inside jokes and passing comments. The thing they admired from a distance and never reached for. A screened porch, coffee at sunrise, quiet water instead of alarms, a place where time could finally slow down. I knew that because years earlier, I had heard something I was never supposed to forget. And once I heard it, I couldn't unknow it. But before any of that could matter, I had to find the man standing somewhere inside their anniversary gift. I moved past the entry and into the great room. Sunlight spilled across the floor in long silver shapes from the lake. One of the dining chairs was pulled out. A cardboard box sat open near the fireplace. And there, by the back windows, with his hand resting on the frame as if measuring the view, the stranger turned to face me. He looked startled. Then he said my last name. The sound of my last name in his mouth stopped me cold. Not because he shouted it, he didn't. He said it carefully, like he was testing whether I was the person he hoped I was. His voice was low, almost cautious. I took another step into the room and looked at him harder. He wasn't dressed like someone breaking in. No crowbar, no panic. Just clean boots, pressed jeans, and that gray jacket zipped halfway up. On the floor beside him sat a long cardboard tube and a flat package wrapped in brown paper. "I'm sorry," he said. "You must be Daniel." I didn't answer right away. I was too busy trying to understand how a stranger in my parents' lake house knew my name. Then he lifted one hand, slow and open. "I think I'm early," he said. "Early for what?" That question hit me hard, but it was enough to keep me from doing something stupid. He didn't look dangerous. If anything, he looked uncomfortable, like he had stepped into the wrong church during a funeral. Still, my pulse was pounding in my throat. I asked him who he was, and he gave me a name I didn't recognize. Then he said he had been told to meet someone connected to the house. He looked from me to the window and back again, like he realized he had just walked into something bigger than he expected. I told him to stay right there. He nodded. I stepped back into the foyer, pulled the door nearly closed behind me, and just stood there for a second with both hands on my hips, breathing through my nose. The hallway was quiet. The photo of my parents still sat on the entry table, smiling in that old black and white frame, untouched by whatever this new complication was. I looked at their younger faces and felt the same thing I had felt for years. They deserved one day that belonged entirely to them. My father spent 36 years working at a machine shop that smelled like hot metal and oil. If you shook his hand after a shift, the skin felt almost polished from labor. He left before sunrise most mornings with coffee in a dented thermos and came home carrying the day in his shoulders. He fixed what broke because paying someone else meant not paying for something we needed more. Brakes, faucets, window seals, the old dryer that had to be kicked twice to start. He never called himself tired. He just sat down slower as the years went on. My mother worked just as hard, only her exhaustion was the kind no one clocks. She did bookkeeping for a dental office for years. Then came home and started the second shift that never ended. Dinner, laundry, forms, birthday, cakes from scratch, because bakery cakes cost too much. She could stretch ground beef, hide worry in her voice, and make a house feel full even when money was thin enough to whistle through. When I was 10, I found an envelope in the kitchen drawer labeled Trip Fund. By the end of that year, it was gone. My sister needed braces. Nobody mentioned the trip again. That was my parents in one small scene. Plans were always movable if one of us needed something. Their marriage looked ordinary from the outside, which is probably why I admire it so much now. There were no grand gestures, no jewelry commercials, no dramatic airport reunions. They built 40 years out of repetitive, unglamorous faithfulness. My father warmed my mother's car on winter mornings before she left for work. My mother cut the burnt edges off his toast because he never noticed the toaster was failing. They argued about bills, about timing, about the right way to load a dishwasher. Once, when I was 13, I heard them whisper fighting in the kitchen over whether they could afford to replace the roof and still help me with summer camp. The next week, I was told camp was full. Years later, I learned it wasn't. That was the shape of their love. Not polished, not cinematic. Chosen again and again, in ways that often looked like subtraction. They skipped things, delayed things, made do. They never said they were heroes. They would have hated that word. But children remember patterns. Children notice who eats the smaller piece, who says, "I'm okay," too quickly, who stays behind so everyone else can go. By the time I was old enough to give anything back, I realized normal gifts would never land right. A watch could be lost, a vacation would end. An anniversary dinner would become another nice night, and then a receipt. I wanted something that held shape, something they could walk through, touch, wake up inside. Something that said I had been paying attention all those years when they thought we were too young to see what it cost them. And somewhere underneath all of that was the lake. Not a random lake. Not a luxury fantasy plucked from nowhere. For my parents, water meant the version of life they never let themselves choose. Slower mornings, quiet evenings, a breeze through screened windows, my father with coffee instead of a time card, my mother reading with her feet tucked under a blanket instead of balancing a checkbook at the kitchen table. The dream was always there, but it lived at the edge of conversation. Too expensive to touch. I knew exactly when I first heard it out loud. And once I heard it, the idea refused to leave me. It happened 7 years before I stood in that foyer with a stranger in the next room. We were at a rented cabin for one weekend in October. The kind of place advertised as rustic charm, but really just meant old pine walls and a heater that clicked all night. My sister had found it online for cheap because the season was ending and half the docks had already been pulled from the water. The lake was cold steel under a pale sky. Leaves kept skittering across the deck in little dry spirals. My mother brought chili in a slow cooker. My father brought a tackle box, even though none of us really believed the fish were biting. It was not a glamorous trip, which is exactly why it felt like us. The first evening, after dinner, we all drifted outside with mismatched mugs. My mother wrapped both hands around hers for warmth. My father stood near the rail in an old flannel jacket with the elbows thinning out. The dock lamp from the neighboring property blinked on across the cove, making a crooked yellow path over the water. Nobody was talking much. Just that comfortable family silence where everyone is tired in the same place. Then my mother said, almost to herself, I could get used to this. My father smiled without turning around. Sure you could. For about 2 days. No, she said, and there was a softness in her voice I still remember. I mean, really. Waking up to this every morning. I think I'd be good at being old here. We all laughed a little because my mother was barely in her 50s and hated being called old. But she kept looking at the lake. My father leaned his elbows on the railing and said, if I ever disappear, that's where I'll be. Small place. Coffee on a porch. No phone ringing. Then he added the part that settled into me and never left. But that's not our kind of life. He said it lightly. No bitterness. No self-pity. Just a fact. The way you might say winter comes early up here. And that was what made it hit harder. They weren't asking, they weren't hinting. They had already placed the dream on a shelf marked not for us and walked away from it. I looked at my mother. She gave that tiny shrug I had seen my whole life. The one that meant maybe in another world. Then she changed the subject and asked my sister if she had packed the extra blankets. Just like that, the moment could have vanished. It didn't vanish for me. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The cabin had those cheap horizontal blinds that clicked every time the wind touched them. I lay there listening to the heater tick and replayed that conversation over and over. I kept seeing my father at the railing, dark water behind him, saying, that's not our kind of life. I knew what he meant. People like my parents did not budget for lake views. They budgeted for tires, medication, school supplies, and roofs. The strange thing was, once the ideas showed up, it didn't feel ridiculous at first. It felt clear. Wild. Yes. Heavy. Definitely. But clear. Then morning came, and clarity turned into math. A lake house for my parents. Secretly, I was not some tech billionaire with money spilling out of a hoodie pocket. I had done well for myself, better than I ever expected, but not reckless well. The numbers started marching through my head before breakfast. Land, construction, permits, furnishings, utilities, taxes, insurance, maintenance. A dream like that had sharp edges. It was expensive to build and expensive to keep. And what if I pulled it off and they hated the attention? What if it embarrassed them? What if giving something that big somehow crossed a line instead of honoring it? I tried to shake it off for months. I told myself it had just been a nice family moment by the water. I went back to work, back to deadlines, flights, invoices, the whole machinery of ordinary life. But the dream kept finding me in strange places. During meetings, in traffic, standing in my own kitchen late at night. I would picture my mother opening a window to hear rain on the lake. I would picture my father finally sitting still without apologizing for it. Then another thought arrived, quieter and much more frightening. If not now, when? My parents were healthy, but time has a way of becoming visible all at once. My father started making that small sound when he stood from a low chair. My mother needed brighter light to read labels. Nothing dramatic, just the body making its gentle announcements. I realized I did not want to wait until the gift became symbolic, too late to really live in. That was when the idea stopped being fantasy and became a private decision. I didn't start with blueprints, I started with a date. Their 40th anniversary was a little over 2 years away. 40 years felt like more than a milestone. It felt like a line in the sand. Long enough to matter, close enough to force action. If I gave myself a deadline that big, maybe I wouldn't back out the first time. The cost scared me. Maybe the date would keep me honest. I remember sitting in my car outside my office garage after making that decision. Rain was running down the windshield in crooked silver tracks. My phone was dark in my hand. I said it out loud, just to hear how impossible it sounded. I'm going to build them a lake house. The words made my stomach drop. And the next question came immediately. How much would impossible actually cost? The first number I got was so high, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was the kind of number your brain rejects before your mouth catches up. I had called a builder 2 counties over and pretended I was exploring options for a small lake build. I remember standing in the parking lot outside my office, one shoe on the curb, listening to him talk in a casual voice about current rates per square foot, site prep, septic, permits, utility runs, and finish levels. By the time he was done, I was staring at a gum wrapper near my tire like it might somehow offer a second opinion. I had known it would be expensive. I had not understood how many different ways expensive could arrive. Land came first, obviously, but land was only the start of the bleeding. A lake lot might look like dirt, trees, and a view, but every beautiful piece of waterfront carried invisible invoices. Survey work, soil testing, setback requirements, septic design, shoreline rules, driveway permits, clearing enough trees to build without stripping away the privacy that made the lot special in the first place. Then there was the house itself. Framing lumber, windows built to handle weather, roofing, siding, HVAC, plumbing, insulation, cabinets, flooring, appliances, lighting, labor for every single trade. And after all that came the things nobody posts online when they show off their finished house. Utility connection fees, drainage work, gravel, gutters, retaining touches, final grading, landscaping, mailbox address marker. Even the stupid brass house numbers cost more than they should have. I made a spreadsheet that grew so wide I had to scroll sideways to see my own delusion. At first I tried to think like a dreamer. Then I forced myself to think like an owner. If I was going to do this, I needed a real cap, not a wish. Not a rounded number meant to make me feel brave. A hard limit tied to actual money. After 3 weeks of calls, estimates, and conversations with people who had built near water, I landed on the biggest number I could say without feeling physically sick. $325,000. That was the ceiling. Land, house, site work, utility runs, permits, basic furnishing, and the hidden costs, waiting with a knife behind every small adjustment. If I crossed that line, the gift became reckless. Worse, it became selfish. I was not going to honor my parents by wrecking my own future to stage a grand gesture. So I built the plan backward. I had savings, but not lake house savings, sitting neatly in one account. I had years of disciplined business income, money that I had not spent when it would have been easy to. I had investments I could liquidate without lighting my long-term plans on fire. I had one rental property I sold at the right time, which gave me more breathing room than anything else. And I had access to a construction loan if the timing of the draw schedule got tight. That last part bothered me. Debt changes the emotional temperature of a gift. Still, I wanted options, not panic. The decision that saved the project came early. I stopped designing for impressiveness and started budgeting for durability. No vaulted ego rooms. No stone fireplace wall costing the price of a car. No luxury finishes chosen just to make people gasp on reveal day. My parents did not need a magazine spread. They needed a house that felt peaceful, held up well, and would not punish them with maintenance. That choice cut more waste than any coupon ever could. I learned quickly that a compact, well-planned footprint beats a larger house filled with expensive dead space. I chose simpler roof lines because complicated roofs leak money before they ever leak water. I kept the plumbing stacked where possible. I selected good windows, but not the kind with brand names people say like status symbols at dinner parties. And every time I cut something flashy, I redirected the money towards something that mattered. Better insulation, better drainage, better access from the driveway in winter, a proper mudroom, quality flooring that could survive wet shoes and years of use. These were not glamorous line items, but they were the bones of a good life. Still, every payment hurt. I wired deposits from a quiet office with the blinds half shut, as if secrecy could make the numbers smaller. I signed design invoices at my kitchen table after midnight. I opened emails with subject lines like revised estimate and change order and felt my stomach tighten before the file even loaded. The whole thing existed in 2 worlds at once. In one world, I was running my normal life. In the other, I was spending $250,000 on a house my parents did not know existed. Some nights I would stare at the spreadsheet and think, this is insane. Other nights I would pull up that old cabin photo from the October trip and remember exactly why I had started. There was one more rule that kept me sane. I built in a contingency from day one. 10% untouched unless truly necessary. Every builder I spoke with said the same thing in different words. If you don't budget for surprises, the surprises become the budget. I hated hearing it. They were right. Even before I had bought a single piece of land, I knew the project would test every number I trusted, which meant the next step mattered even more than the money. I needed the right lot, or the whole plan would collapse before it ever had walls. So I started driving, weekends mostly, some Fridays if I could leave work early and invent a believable reason for being out of town. I put hundreds of miles on my truck over the next few months, bouncing between counties, taking calls with local agents, and walking parcels that looked perfect online and disappointing in person. One lot had gorgeous water but backed up to a busy road where motorcycles screamed past every 10 minutes. Another had privacy and trees, but the shoreline dropped off so sharply you needed mountain goat confidence just to reach the water. One place looked cheap enough to make the whole budget breathe easier, until I learned half the property sat in a floodplain and the county would barely let me breathe near it without another permit. Lakefront land has a talent for lying to you. A listing can say water access and mean you'll need climbing gear. It can say wooded privacy and mean mosquitoes the size of walnuts and no clear build site. It can say year-round road and leave out the fact that the last half mile turns into axle-deep sludge in spring. I learned quickly to stop falling in love from photos. I started carrying rubber boots, a tape measure, county maps, and a folder full of questions that made some agents visibly tired. Where are the setbacks from the shoreline? Has the lot been surveyed recently? Is there an approved perk test? Any drainage issues after heavy rain? What are the HOA rules, if any? Can I place a dock? Can I clear selectively? What's the utility distance to the road? Any wetlands flagged? Some people heard small lake house and assumed simple. It was never simple. Waterfront property comes with a whole second layer of invisible boundaries. Environmental restrictions, shoreline buffers, tree preservation rules, septic limitations based on soil that may or may not cooperate. One county wanted a larger setback than the next. Another had stricter slope requirements. At one site, I stood with an engineer who poked the ground with a metal rod and explained, very politely, that the land I thought was charming and natural was basically an expensive sponge. He saved me a disaster. One kept notes on every parcel, not just price and acreage, but feeling. My parents would not have been happy on a flashy lot with huge neighboring houses and jet skis tearing up the quiet. They wouldn't want a place where every weekend felt like a competition. I knew their rhythms. My mother loves morning light but hates feeling exposed. My father likes neighbors in theory and distance in practice. They needed peace but not isolation. Water but not a cliff. Trees but not so many that the whole place felt damp and shut in. Good road access for winter. Enough room for family to visit. A shoreline you could actually walk down to with coffee in your hand. That combination was harder to find than I expected. Then one wet April afternoon, I turned down a narrow gravel lane an agent had almost forgotten to mention. The rain had just stopped. Mist was still hanging low between the pines, and the whole road smelled like cedar bark and mud. At the end of the lane was a lot that didn't scream at me. It didn't have some dramatic overlook or giant carved stone entry. It was quiet, gently sloped, wide enough to breathe, tucked just far enough off the road that the lake revealed itself slowly through the trees. I got out of the truck and heard almost nothing. No traffic, no generators. Just a woodpecker somewhere uphill and small waves brushing the shore. The water was calmer there than at the other lots I had seen, protected by the curve of a narrow cove. The shoreline wasn't huge, but it was usable. Flat enough near the house site. Clean sight lines, mature trees framing the view instead of blocking it. A little ridge on one side that gave privacy from the neighboring parcel. I walked down toward the water, my boots sinking into dark, wet leaves, and I could picture my father standing there with his mug before I even reached the bank. That was the first sign. The second came when I stood near where the future porch would be and saw the sunrise path in my head. East-facing but softened by trees. Morning light for my mother. Shade in the late afternoon, not a showpiece, a life piece. It was not the cheapest lot, not even close. There were cheaper parcels farther out and rougher ones I could have forced into submission. But this one matched them. That mattered more than squeezing every dollar until the soul came out of the plan. Even then, I didn't rush. I ordered a survey, paid for soil work, checked zoning, asked about shoreline restrictions, verified the legal access easement, confirmed utility reach, called the county twice because the first answer sounded too easy. That call alone saved me from assuming I could place the house closer to the water than allowed. I learned that buying land without doing this homework is how people end up owning a beautiful legal headache. When the survey stakes finally went in, little strips of bright pink ribbon fluttered in the trees like tiny warnings. I walked the boundary alone near sunset, stepping over roots, tracing the lines of the future in my head. I could hear frogs starting up near the cove. The air smelled like damp earth and thawing pine needles. My phone rang with the agent's number. Another buyer was asking questions. I stood there looking at that water, at those ribbons, at the exact place where my parents' porch could be, and I knew hesitation was over. The offer I sent that night was the point of no return. The offer was accepted 48 hours later. I remember reading the email twice in the glow of my laptop at midnight, then closing the screen and just sitting there in the dark. The land was real now. It had coordinates, taxes, a parcel number, a set of boundaries marked on county documents, and survey pins in damp earth, which meant the next phase could no longer live in broad fantasy terms. I wasn't daydreaming about a lake house anymore. I was deciding where my mother would set down her coffee cup on her first morning there. That changed the way I approached everything. I hired a residential designer instead of chasing a dramatic custom architect ego project. I needed someone practical, patient, and good at listening when I said strange things like, "Can we make this house feel easy on tired knees without making it look like a medical brochure?" We met in a small office with sample boards leaning against the wall and a coffee ring on every flat surface. I brought a notebook full of observations I had gathered over years without realizing. I was collecting them for this exact moment. My father always set his keys in the same spot near the door. My mother liked to cook with every ingredient visible at once. Neither of them liked narrow hallways. My father got up before sunrise, even on vacation. My mother hated carrying laundry upstairs. They both pretended they didn't mind overnight guests, but they loved having family near. Those notes became walls, windows, and traffic flow. The house needed to live mostly on one level. That part was non-negotiable. Bedrooms on the main floor, wide passages, gentle transitions. No grand staircase demanding healthy ankles and a cheerful attitude. I wanted them to age into the house, not out of it. We built in a zero-step entry from the garage side, enough turning space in the primary bath, and a shower they could walk into without climbing over a tub lip. None of it looked clinical. That was important. Good, accessible design should feel invisible when it's done right. The kitchen took the most thought because kitchens reveal truth. People can claim to want sleek things, but their habits tell another story. My mother needed generous counters, but not acres of useless stone. She needed drawers more than lower cabinets because bending and digging are different forms of punishment. She needed tough surfaces that could survive dropped pans, wet grocery bags, and years of actual cooking. Not staged cooking. Real cooking. Soups, casseroles, pie crust, flour, holiday overflow. I added deep pullouts, simple hardware, and a pantry positioned where unloading groceries would not become a daily obstacle course. Then there was the window over the sink. I argued for that window more than any other feature. Not because it was expensive, because the angle had to be exact. If she was washing dishes or rinsing fruit or standing there lost in thought, I wanted her to see a clean slice of lake and sky, not a neighbor's dock. Not a post. That one-frame view became a quiet obsession. It reminded me of our old house, where she used to stand over the sink and look out at a chain-link fence and the side of a garage while saying, "At least the light is nice this morning." I wanted to upgrade the light. Designing in secret turned out to be its own weird skill. I couldn't call my parents and casually ask, "How do you feel about 12-foot patio sliders?" without detonating suspicion. So I had to gather information sideways. I asked my mother, during a normal conversation, whether she still liked open shelves. She said no immediately and launched into a complaint about dust. Useful. I asked my father if he preferred screened porches or open decks for a friend's cabin idea. He answered with suspicious speed. Screened? Because bugs ruin honesty. Also useful, I paid attention to the shoes they wore inside, the chairs they found comfortable, the way they moved through space when they visited my place. Every answer shaped the design. Lakeside homes punish pretty mistakes. Moisture gets into everything. Wind finds loose details and worries them to death. If storage is skimpy, coats, boots, fishing gear, and extra blankets colonize every chair in the house. We chose materials accordingly. Durable flooring, better ventilation in bathrooms. Exterior finishes that could take weather without becoming constant maintenance. A heating system sized for real winters, not brochure winters. extra insulation, a proper mudroom with hooks, benches, and a floor that could tolerate wet boots and dogs, even though my parents didn't own one. Grandkids and guests eventually bring mess with them. The house had to be ready. The most personal details stayed almost hidden. A built-in bench in the hallway echoed the one my father made from leftover lumber when I was a kid. The breakfast nook was sized for the exact kind of small round table my parents had kept for 20 years. Even after the finish wore thin. The guest room faced the side yard where children could run without anyone worrying about the water. And in the great room, we placed a pair of windows high enough to catch the first amber line of sunrise in winter. My father used to wake me before dawn on school snow days and say, "Come see the sky before the weather ruins it." I never forgot that. By the time the drawings were finalized, the house looked simple on paper. That was deceptive. Because now I had something far more dangerous than an idea. I had a complete plan, a buildable set, and a secret big enough to start attracting problems. Problems began before the first wall went up. That was my first real education in building. People imagine construction starts when the foundation crew arrives and a machine tears up the dirt. It actually starts earlier, in the slow frustration of approvals, revisions, signatures, and someone at a county office deciding your file can wait 3 more days because a box was checked in blue ink instead of black. I wish that were a joke. It isn't. The shoreline setback issue surfaced first. One measurement on an early site plan was interpreted differently by the county reviewer than by the designer. Not a huge difference on paper. A very huge difference when your whole layout depends on where the house can legally sit. I was standing in line at a pharmacy when my phone buzzed with the email. I stepped outside, read it, and felt that heavy drop in my stomach that became familiar over the next year. We had to revise the placement, resubmit part of the package, and wait. Waiting does strange things to a deadline. It doesn't just consume days. It makes every future trade less certain. Then the weather joined in. The site cleared during a wet stretch of spring, and what looked manageable on the survey became a churned-up mess under equipment. I drove out one Saturday morning in boots and watched a skid steer sink deep enough to make everybody quiet. Clay and water had formed that kind of stubborn, slick mud that grabs tires and patience equally. The excavation foreman looked at the ground, looked at me, and gave me the same expression doctors used before, saying, "We'll monitor it." He told me we could keep forcing the schedule and pay for it later, or wait for better conditions and keep the site cleaner. I chose to wait. It felt terrible and right at the same time. That was the first moment I understood the difference between urgency and panic. If you build in panic, the mistakes get buried where you can't see them until years later. So I started making rules for myself. 1. Never let emotions sign a change order. 2. Get every scope in writing, even with the nicest contractor on earth. 3. Build a timeline cushion because every clean schedule is half fantasy. 4. Visit the site often enough to notice problems early, but not so often that you become the kind of owner everyone avoids. The contingency fund stopped being theoretical almost immediately. Lumber shifted upward. Not enough to destroy the project, but enough to bite. A utility trench needed more work than expected because the ground gave us a mix of rock and wet soil. The septic layout changed after the detailed field review. Then one subcontractor I had counted on got delayed by another project running over, which meant the next trade had to be moved, which meant 2 small schedule adjustments turned into a month of shuffling. Construction is a line of dominoes pretending to be a calendar. There were days I drove home furious at no one in particular. And there were days the site gave me just enough hope to keep moving. The morning the foundation was poured, I got there before the crew left and walked to the edge while the concrete still looked dark and damp. For the first time, the rooms had shape. I could stand where the kitchen would be. I could face the water from what would become the great room. I could feel the gift entering the physical world. That helped. So did the framers. They moved fast, and once the skeleton rose, the house suddenly stopped being a stack of invoices and became a place. Then summer storms slowed the roof crew. Then a window package got pushed back. Then an inspector missed a scheduled slot and bumped us to the following week. There was one night I seriously considered moving the reveal date. I was sitting in my truck outside the site with the wipers clicking back and forth in weak rain. The house was framed and wrapped, but still looked raw. The anniversary was getting closer. Every delay felt louder now because the finish line had a family face. If this had been my own vacation house, I might have shrugged and said, "It's done when it's done." But this was tied to a date with emotional weight. 40 years. I had built the whole plan around that number. Missing it would not just be inconvenient. It would feel like dropping a promise no one knew I had made. So I called the general contractor and asked him, very directly, what was realistic. That conversation saved me from both false hope and unnecessary despair. He walked me through the critical path: roofing, dry-in, rough-ins, inspections, insulation, drywall, finished carpentry, cabinetry, final systems, punch list. He told me where we had slack and where we didn't. He also told me something that stuck. You can spend money to go faster, but you can't always spend your way around sequencing. That sentence kept me from making several expensive mistakes. I tightened decisions. No lingering on finished choices. No emotional indecision over trim profiles at midnight. I approved materials faster, answered contractor questions faster, showed up when needed, and kept records of every change. A clear contract and a clean paper trail are not glamorous, but they are armor. I learned that a builder's memory and an owner's memory become two different movies under stress. Still, under all the practical problem solving was one private fear I never fully said out loud. What if I spent all this money, survived all this chaos, and the final house still didn't feel like them? That question stayed with me right up until the walls closed in and the secret got even harder to protect. Once the framing went up, secrecy became harder than construction. Before that, the project mostly lived in documents, calls, and muddy visits to a lot my parents had never seen. But a framed house is a fact. Rooflines show up above trees. Delivery trucks leave tracks. Neighbors get curious. Contractors talk. And somehow, at the exact moment the secret became physically obvious, my parents became more attentive than they had been in years. My mother started calling me on Saturdays. Not every Saturday, just enough to make me nervous. "What are you up to today?" she would ask in that casual tone mothers use when they are absolutely conducting an investigation. I got very good at answering with partial truths. Just handling some property stuff. True. Meeting a guy about a project. Also true. Running out toward the lake for work. Technically true, depending on how flexible your ethics are. My father was less direct, which made him more dangerous. He noticed patterns. If I missed a family lunch, he remembered. If my truck had mud up the sides in a dry week, he asked where I'd been. Once, while helping him move an old shelf in his garage, he glanced at a set of rolled plans sticking out of my back seat and said, "Building something." I told him they were for a small office renovation. He nodded, but not in a convinced way, in a filing it away way. That night, I moved every project paper into a locking cabinet. The secret turned into a group effort, whether I liked that or not. My sister, Lauren, became the unofficial decoy coordinator. She was better at lying with a straight face than I was, which sounds bad until you understand she used her powers for family. If our parents wondered why I couldn't make dinner, Lauren suddenly needed help with something imaginary. If my mother asked why I was always on the phone lately, Lauren would launch into a long story about a fake business issue and redirect a conversation. My wife, Emily, handled the emotional side. She could hear the strain in my voice before I admitted it. More than once, she took my phone from my hand and said, "You're not calling the contractor at 10:40 p.m. to ask about baseboard height." She was usually right. The contractors became part of the secret too, though I kept that circle tight. The general contractor knew the house was for my parents. So did the designer. A couple of key subs knew enough to stay careful. The electrician once almost texted a progress photo to the wrong contact because my father and I share the same first initial. After that scare, I renamed people in my phone like I was running a small undercover operation. My parents became Aunt May and Tire Shop. The lake house went into the calendar as client site. Material deliveries were discussed in coded language while I stood in grocery aisles pretending to compare cereal prices. It would have been funny if it weren't exhausting. And then there were the near misses. One Sunday afternoon, my parents drove through the same county on their way back from visiting old friends. I found this out because my mother casually mentioned, "We took the scenic route by the water." My heart slammed so hard I had to set down the glass I was holding. The house was not visible from any main road. But that did not stop me from spending the next hour checking my phone and texting the site superintendent like a paranoid maniac. Another time, my father mentioned that a retired neighbor of theirs had seen new construction near the cove and asked if I knew anything about the area because you're always researching stuff. I shrugged. I changed the subject. I went home sweating. The supporting cast got bigger in strange ways. A local neighbor near the lot, Mrs. Dorsey, watched the road more carefully than any security system. She was in her 70s, wore bright gardening gloves, and somehow knew every vehicle that didn't belong. She called me once to say, "Your cabinet people came," but the tall one nearly backed into the birch. After that, she became my unofficial lookout. The florist helping with the anniversary staging agreed to keep deliveries unmarked. Even the appliance store manager played along after realizing why. I kept asking that nothing be mailed to my home address with product photos on the front. Still, the weirdest part was hiding the emotional truth, not the logistics. My parents would say simple things that nearly broke me. My mother, seeing me tired, once said, "Don't work so hard. Save something good for yourself." My father joked that for their 40th, all they needed was takeout and a nap. I laughed with them while thinking, if this works, you have no idea what's waiting. If it fails, I can never explain the size of what almost happened. That pressure changed me. I became jumpy, over-careful, too fast to answer harmless questions. Emily noticed before anyone else. One night, after I snapped at a perfectly normal text from Lauren about paint swatches, Emily looked at me across the kitchen island and said, "You know secrets don't stay clean forever, right?" I asked what she meant. She dried her hands on a dish towel and gave me that look spouses have when they are about to be annoyingly wise. "The bigger the secret," she said, "the more mess it makes around the edges." At the time, I thought she meant stress. I didn't realize those edges were already starting to fray, and that the cost of keeping everything hidden would follow me all the way to the front door of the finished house. By the final month, the house looked finished to anyone who didn't know better. That is one of the cruel jokes of building a place. Can have walls, paint, cabinets, lights, and still be nowhere near ready. Finished is not the same as livable. Ready is not the same as warm. In those last weeks, I learned that the structure was only half the gift. The harder part was giving the house a pulse. The countdown became brutal. Every day had a list. Every list had 3 things that could break the schedule. Utility hookups had to be finalized. The septic had to pass. The driveway needed final grading before the landscaping crew could do their part. Touch-up paint waited on trim completion. The appliance install shifted twice. Internet, which I didn't even care about emotionally, somehow became a problem with the power company because one service map had an old address marker still attached to the parcel. I spent an entire Tuesday bouncing between a utility rep, the county, and a man named Rick, who kept saying, "That's strange," in the exact tone people use before adding 6 more days to your life. Inspections were the real heartbeat of those weeks. You can do everything right and still end up hostage to one person's schedule. I stood in the mud beside the porch one morning while an inspector checked systems with a clipboard and a face like wet drywall. He wasn't rude, just impossible to read. He moved room to room, opening panels, checking outlets, noting something on every page. The house was quiet except for the wind brushing the siding and the soft metallic clink of his flashlight against his belt. When he finally said, "Looks good overall," I felt my whole body unclench so fast it almost hurt. That afternoon, I bought coffee for 3 contractors and drove back out to the house with it like a grateful fool. Then came the furniture. Not fancy show-home furniture, that had never been the plan. I wanted it to feel like my parents could walk in, sit down, and immediately recognize the life waiting for them. A solid sofa with washable fabric. Chairs deep enough for reading. A dining table that could survive holidays, elbows, card games, and hot casserole dishes. Emily helped me with most of it, which saved the house from becoming one large male decision. She would stand in an empty room with a lamp in one hand and say things like, "This looks expensive but not kind." She was almost always right. We carried in rugs while the floors still smelled faintly of finish and sawdust. We assembled beds while late sunlight moved slowly across the walls. We unwrapped kitchenware and stacked plain white dishes into cabinets that had been empty only hours before. The first time I heard spoons settle into a drawer divider, something shifted. It was such a small sound, but it made the place feel less like a project and more like a home. That part caught me off guard. I had spent so long managing budgets, timelines, and problems that I wasn't prepared for how emotional the staging would feel. Every object seemed to carry a sentence. "These are your mugs. This is where you'll keep the blankets. This is the chair where Dad will pretend he isn't asleep. This is the hook where Mom will hang the market tote." I brought old framed family photos and placed them carefully. My parents dancing badly at a wedding, us as kids on a camping trip. My father holding a fish with the expression of a man trying not to brag. My mother younger than I had ever really understood, laughing at something outside the frame. The house softened with each thing. Outside, the landscaping crew shaped the final approach to feel natural, not overworked. Native grasses by the drive. Low shrubs by the porch. Mulch dark as coffee grounds. I stood with a lead landscaper near the water and asked him to keep the shoreline edge simple. No decorative nonsense. My parents liked places that felt settled, not styled. The lake wind carried the smell of turned dirt, wet cedar, and cut grass. By dusk, when the porch lights came on against the blue-gray siding, the whole place looked less built than arrived. We still had stupid little emergencies. A cabinet door needed adjustment. One bathroom fan made a clicking sound. A section of trim near the mudroom had a paint issue that looked minor until you actually looked at it. The refrigerator was delayed by 12 hours and arrived with packaging damage that turned out to be cosmetic, which I would have called a blessing if I hadn't been too tired to believe in blessings that week. I slept badly, ate standing up, drove the same roads so often I could feel every curve before I turned it. But in those final days, relief finally started to win. The deed paperwork was in order. The utilities were live. The house was clean. The pantry held coffee, crackers, soup, olive oil, and the little cinnamon tea my mother always bought when she wanted to feel indulgent. Fresh towels were folded in the bathroom. Firewood was stacked by the hearth. On the entry table, I placed that black and white photo of my parents at 23. I brought a cake. I chilled wine. I tucked the key into a small box lined with blue paper. 2 nights before the anniversary, I locked up after sunset and stood alone on the porch. The lake was black glass. A single dock light blinked far across the cove. The new porch swing moved once in the wind and settled. For the first time in years, I let myself believe it. We had made it. The budget had bent but held. The schedule had staggered but survived. The secret was still intact. The hardest part, I thought, was finally behind me. By the next morning, someone else had entered the house. I got there earlier than I needed to because I couldn't sit still at home another minute. The cake was in a cooler behind my seat, boxed in white with blue ribbon. The wine rolled softly once when I turned onto the gravel lane. In the passenger seat sat the folder with the deed, insurance paperwork, utility information, and a handwritten letter I had rewritten 3 times because every version sounded either too formal or too sentimental. The morning was cool enough that mist still clung low over the water. Sunlight came in broken flashes through the pines as I drove, lighting the dashboard, then disappearing, then returning again. I remember thinking, this is it. Not the build. Not the budget. Not the secret calls and muddy boots and contractor delays. This was the actual threshold. In less than an hour, I would pick up my parents under the excuse of anniversary lunch, drive them out to the lake, and watch 40 years of postponed peace become real in front of them. I was rehearsing stupid details in my head, where I would park, whether I'd hand them the key box first or wait until they reached the porch, whether my mother would cry immediately or go silent first. Then I came around the final bend and saw a car I didn't recognize. Dark sedan. Parked crooked near the side of the drive. Not one of the contractor trucks. Not the landscaper. Not a utility van. No markings. No trailer. Just a stranger's car sitting beside the house I had locked myself less than 48 hours earlier. My foot hit the brake so hard the cooler slid. At first I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the general contractor had sent someone for a last-minute touch-up. Maybe an inspector had returned for some paperwork issue. Maybe one of the staging deliveries had gotten the date wrong. My brain produced possibilities fast, almost helpfully, because the alternative came with a jolt of pure panic. Then I saw movement through the front window. A man crossed the kitchen. Not in a hurry, not peeking. Not acting like someone afraid of being seen. He moved with the calm, casual confidence of a person in his own space. He paused near the sink, turned slightly toward the lake, and set something down on the counter. Sun flashed on the glass behind him, turning his outline sharp for one strange second. Gray jacket, broad back, older than me by at least 20 years. I did not know him. Everything inside me went hot, then cold. The whole surprise suddenly felt fragile, ridiculous, even $325,000, years of planning, every inch measured against memory and meaning. All of it narrowed to one ugly fear. Someone had gotten inside, and whatever happened next could contaminate the day before it even began. If this was a trespasser, I had a problem. If this was a scam, I had a bigger one. If there had been some paperwork disaster, some title issue, some realtor mistake so absurd it bordered on criminal, I didn't even know where to place my anger. I pulled farther in and killed the engine. Silence rushed at me. The lake was flat and almost offensively peaceful. A pair of small waves folded into the shoreline below the house. Somewhere in the trees, a bird gave one sharp call and stopped. The porch swing moved once in the breeze. There were flowers in the beds Emily and I had fussed over. The house looked perfect. That was the unbearable part. Nothing outside signaled damage or chaos. No broken lock. No smashed window. No signs of forced entry. Just calm. And a stranger inhabiting the center of it. I stayed in the driver's seat for 1 second too long, trying to slow my breathing. Call someone. The contractor, maybe. Or the sheriff. But what would I even say? There's a man in my parents' surprise house, and I need him removed before lunch. If I called my general contractor and he didn't answer, the panic would only deepen. If I called the police and this turned out to be some mix-up, I'd create a scene impossible to explain. My parents were expecting me in less than an hour. Time was now part of the threat. So I grabbed my keys and got out. The gravel cracked under my shoes. The air smelled like pine sap and cold water. I opened the back door just enough to make sure the deed folder was still there, as if one bizarre problem had made every other disaster imaginable. It was. The white cake box sat steady beside it, ribbon lifting slightly in the breeze. For a second, the contrast made me almost dizzy. Celebration in the car, unknown man in the house. I started toward the porch. Halfway there, I noticed the front door wasn't fully closed. A narrow, dark seam showed between the door and frame. I knew I had checked that lock before leaving the house 2 nights earlier. I could still remember the brass handle cool in my hand. I had tested it twice. The detail landed hard because it meant one of two things. Either somebody had keys, or somebody had been invited. Invited by who? I slowed near the steps and looked toward the side of the house. No one else, no movement. The sedan's hood ticked softly as it cooled. I climbed the porch one board at a time, each step giving off that new house creak I knew so well by then. The windows reflected the lake, then cleared as I shifted angle, and I caught sight of him again farther inside. He bent slightly near the dining area, like he was examining something on the table. My jaw tightened. I put one hand on the door and listened. A footstep, a drawer sliding, then stillness. I pushed it open and stepped into the foyer, where sunlight lay across the new oak floor in long pale strips. The whole place smelled of fresh wood, clean paint, and the faint mineral scent of the lake drifting through an unseen crack. On the entry table, that old black and white photo of my parents sat exactly where I had left it, untouched. The dining chair nearest the kitchen was pulled out. A cardboard tube rested against the wall. Brown paper lay folded beside it. Then the man turned from the back windows as if he had been expecting me all along. And in a voice that was calm enough to make everything feel worse, he said my last name. What did you just say? My voice came out sharper than I meant it to. The man didn't move toward me. He stayed by the back windows with both hands visible, one resting lightly on the top of a dining chair. Up close, he looked less like a threat and more like someone carrying the wrong kind of gravity. His face was lined, tired around the eyes. Careful. You're Daniel Mercer, he said again, but softer this time. I was told you'd be the one that did not calm me down. Told by who? I asked. He glanced toward the cardboard tube and the flat package on the floor, then back at me. My name is Thomas Bell. I'm sorry for coming in before you got here. I thought someone from the build team would meet me. I stared at him. How did you get inside? The side door code, he said. My stomach dropped. I had given that temporary code to exactly 3 people in the final week. My contractor, Emily, and Lauren. Nobody else. Thomas must have seen something change in my face because he immediately added, it came from the closing attorney's office. Or at least that's what I was told. I know how this looks. How this looked was bad. For one ugly second, I thought paperwork scammed, title fraud. Some bizarre seller issue crawling out at the last possible moment. I stepped farther into the room, close enough now to see that the brown paper package was tied with an old cotton string, not shipping tape. The cardboard tube had water stains on one end. Nothing about it looked legal or official. It looked personal, which somehow felt even less safe. What do you want? I asked. Thomas held my gaze, then gave me an answer I did not expect. I think this house is sitting where your parents fell in love. The room went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I actually laughed once, without humor. No. He nodded slowly, like he had expected disbelief. That's fair. I didn't believe it either at first. He reached into his jacket, and every nerve in my body tightened. Then he stopped halfway and said, May I? Only when I gave the smallest nod did he pull out a worn envelope, yellowed at the edges and folded enough times to have softened. He didn't hand it to me yet. My mother owned this parcel before the sale, he said. Not just this lot. Years ago, our family had a fishing camp here. Tiny cabins. A bait shed. One long dock that should have been replaced 10 times and never was. His mouth shifted with the memory, half smile, half ache. Your father worked here one summer when he was young. 79, maybe 80. Handy kid, quiet, fell for a girl who came up with her aunt for 2 weeks. My chest tightened. He looked at the black and white photo on the entry table from where he stood. When I saw your last name in the closing paperwork, I thought it was a coincidence. Mercer is not exactly rare. But then I found my mother's old camp box in the attic after she passed. Inside were notes, guest receipts, and photographs she never threw away. One of them, he nodded toward the package on the floor. One of them was your parents. I didn't speak. I couldn't. The old cabin trip flashed into my head with my mother saying she could be old by the water. Then another memory surfaced from much farther back. I was maybe 14, helping my father sort tools in the garage. He had been talking about summer jobs and old trucks and people who disappear from your life without warning. He mentioned, almost in passing, there was a place on a lake once, best summer I ever had. I asked, which lake? He smiled in that private way of his and said, long gone now. I had never asked again. Thomas must have seen recognition hit me because his shoulders loosened an inch. Your father fixed motors and patched docks for my grandfather. Your mother came up visiting her aunt, Mabel Pearson. My mother liked her right away. Said she had a laugh you could hear from the kitchen and a way of making your father forget every job he was supposed to be doing. This time, the smile reached his eyes. According to my mother, they sat on the end of the dock after closing every night they could. The whole room tilted emotionally. Not from fear now, from the strange shock of hidden history suddenly becoming physical. I looked at the package again. Why are you here? Thomas's face changed, more solemn now. Because my mother left instructions. He said, if the land ever sold outside the family, I was to give this to the couple in the photo if they could be found. If not, then to their children. He lowered the envelope. She wrote that some places hold people's beginnings, and those beginnings should be returned if possible. He bent slowly, picked up the flat package, and carried it to the dining table. He untied the cotton string with hands that were steady but deliberate, like the object mattered enough to deserve patience. Inside was an old framed photograph, larger than I expected. The glass had been replaced recently. The image was faded but clear. My parents, younger even than the photo on the entry table. My mother barefoot on a dock, hair blown wild by lake wind. My father beside her, smiling in a way I had never seen in any other picture of him. He looked open, unarmored. Behind them, unmistakable, even in the age-softened image, was this cove. The same shoreline, the same bend of water. I put a hand on the table to steady myself. Thomas set the envelope beside the frame. There's a letter, too, he said. From my mother. She wrote it years ago after the camp closed. She always thought they'd come back. I looked from the photo to him. You mean all this time? They knew this place. Not this house, he said, but this water. This exact water. Then he gave me the final piece. The closing attorney called because my mother's estate file mentioned the instructions. Your sister confirmed your parents' anniversary and said if there was ever a day to bring it, this was it. Lauren. Of course, Lauren. The secret had not broken. It had widened. And suddenly the house was no longer just the place I had built for my parents' future. It was standing on top of their beginning, which meant I had less than an hour to decide how to hand them. Not one surprise, but two. The next 40 minutes passed in a blur of adjustment and controlled panic. Thomas stayed, but only after we agreed on exactly how. He would wait inside until I brought my parents in. No dramatic entrance, no confusing overlap at the driveway. The photograph and letter were placed on the dining table where the lake light hit them softly but clearly. I called Lauren from the porch. The second she answered, I said, you need to explain why there's a man in the house with our parents' history in his jacket. She went quiet for half a beat, then exhaled. She said the attorney's office had contacted her 2 days earlier because Thomas couldn't reach me. She had planned to tell me that morning, but she lost her nerve when she realized how close we were to the reveal and how emotional it might make everything. I wanted to be mad. I was too overwhelmed to sustain it. All I said was, you owe me for the rest of your life. She laughed once, then started crying before I did, which was somehow very Lauren. By the time I picked up my parents, I had managed to get my face under control. Barely. They were dressed for a nice lunch. My mother wore a navy blouse and the silver earrings she saved for dinners out. My father had on a sports coat he always claimed made him look like a banker, even though it just made him look like a man trying to be polite. They got into my SUV, bickering softly about whether we were late. Normal. Comfortingly normal. My mother asked where we were going, and I gave the same vague answer I had been using for weeks. Just somewhere with a view. My father looked at me from the passenger seat. That's either very good or very expensive. It can be both, I said. He laughed. My hands tightened on the wheel. As we turned off the main road and onto the gravel lane, the mood inside the car shifted. My mother went quiet first. She was looking out through the trees at flashes of water, trying to place the route. My father straightened slightly in his seat. He didn't say anything, but I saw his eyes narrow in concentration. "You've been here before," my mother said. "A few times," I answered. The house appeared through the pines the way it had appeared to me, that wet afternoon when the lot first felt right. Not all at once. First the roofline, then the porch. Then the windows opening toward the lake. I parked in the drive and cut the engine. No one moved. The silence inside the car was different now. Not confusion exactly. More like the hush before something breaks open. My mother spoke first, almost whispering. "Oh, that's beautiful." My father was still staring. "Whose place is this?" I reached into the back seat, took the small blue-lined key box and the folder, then turned toward them. My pulse was so loud I could hear it in my ears. "It's yours," I said. For a second, the words did not land. They just hung there between us. My mother blinked at me like she had misheard. My father gave a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, except nothing in his face was laughing. "Daniel," my mother said softly, "what do you mean?" I opened the box and held out the key. "I built it for you, for your anniversary. For both of you." No one spoke. Then my mother covered her mouth with her hand. My father looked away toward the house, then back at me, then down at the key as if it might be a prop in a joke he had not caught up to yet. I had imagined tears, maybe a hug, maybe shock. I had not imagined that silence. It was total. The kind of silence people make when they have run out of all their practiced reactions and are left with the raw thing underneath. My father opened his door first. He got out slowly, not like an old man, but like a man walking into a memory he wasn't sure he trusted. My mother followed, one hand still near her face. The wind off the lake lifted the edge of her hair. I watched them stand there in the driveway, shoulder to shoulder, taking in the porch, the cedar posts, the long bank of windows facing the water. My father's eyes moved over the house with an expression I had only seen once before. At my college graduation, when pride and disbelief had collided too fast for him to hide either. Inside, it became even quieter. They stepped through the foyer and immediately saw the old photo on the entry table. My mother touched the frame before she touched anything else. Then the great room opened around them, and the lake spread out beyond the glass. She stopped completely. My father took 3 more steps and turned in a slow circle, seeing the kitchen, the porch, the morning light falling across the sink window. "You remembered that," my mother said. She was looking at the sink. I swallowed hard. "Yeah." My father rested his hand on the back of one of the chairs and looked toward the mudroom bench. "That's my old shop bench. Not the actual one," I said, smiling through the pressure in my throat, just inspired by it. He nodded once, eyes already wet. They noticed everything the way only people who have lived a life can notice. The easy hallway width, the bedroom on the main floor, the round breakfast nook, the screened porch, the hooks by the door, the pantry shelves, the deep drawers in the kitchen. None of it needed explanation. That was the part that undid me. They recognized themselves in the house immediately, not as taste, as care. Then my father saw the dining table. He stopped so suddenly, my mother almost bumped into him. There, in the lake light, sat the old framed photograph Thomas had brought. My mother gave a small, sharp sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob. My father moved closer, one hand trembling as he reached toward the glass. "That Doc," he said. "No." And from the hallway behind them, Thomas stepped forward. Thomas stopped a few feet away and let the silence do the work first. My parents turned toward him with the same expression I must have worn earlier that morning, startled. Searching, trying to place a face against a memory that had gone soft around the edges. Thomas introduced himself gently, then said his mother's name. That did it. My father's hand went to his chest. My mother sat down without meaning to, as if her knees had simply decided the moment was too large to stand through. "Mary Bell's boy." My mother said. Thomas smiled, and suddenly he looked younger. "The youngest one, the one who used to steal bait and blame the raccoons." My father laughed then, not a polite laugh. A real one, cracked open by surprise. It broke the tension in the room and turned everything human again. Thomas told them about the camp records, the attic box, the instructions his mother had left. Then he handed over the letter. My mother read it first, but halfway through, her voice gave out and my father took over. The letter was simple. Mary wrote about a summer full of storms, dock repairs, and one young couple who sat by the water every night and acted like the rest of the world could wait. She said some beginnings deserve a shoreline. That was the moment my father cried. Not dramatically, just quietly. One hand covering his mouth, shoulders folding in a little. My mother leaned into him, and the framed photo sat on the table between them like proof that memory had shape after all. I stood near the kitchen and felt the whole project reorder itself in my head. I had built them a home for the life ahead. But somehow, without planning it, I had also led them back to where part of their life started. After Thomas left, we stayed in the house for hours. No formal speeches, no grand ribbon cutting. We wandered. My mother opened drawers and laughed at how well I knew her habits. My father stood on the porch so long his coffee went cold. At one point, he called me out there and pointed across the cove toward a line of trees. The dock was over there, he said, a little farther left. I fell in trying to impress your mother. My mother called from inside. You fell in because you were showing off. He smiled at the water. Same thing. In the weeks after, the house changed the family in ways I didn't fully expect. My parents did not move in full-time right away. That would have been too abrupt, too unlike them. Instead, they started with weekends. Then long weekdays. Then stretches where they came back to town, only for appointments or church. Their routines softened. My mother began sending sunrise photos to the family group chat with captions like, "Not a bad office." My father started keeping a small notebook on the porch where he wrote weather patterns, bird sightings, and half-finished thoughts that looked suspiciously like peace. The rest of us changed to the lake house became a gathering point without becoming a burden, and that distinction mattered. I had worried about giving a gift so large that it came with hidden obligation. So I handled the practical side before the emotion could outrun the structure. The title was set up carefully. I paid for legal help instead of winging it with family trust and optimism. We created a clean ownership arrangement, clear insurance coverage, and a maintenance reserve so a failed pump or storm damage would not turn gratitude into stress. Taxes, utilities, repairs, seasonal upkeep. I built those realities into the gift because romance without planning is how generosity becomes resentment later. That may be the least cinematic part of the story, but it is one of the most important. A house is not a present you hand over once. It is a living responsibility. Roofs age. Wood moves. Lake weather tests everything. If you build for people you love, you cannot stop at the reveal. You have to think about accessibility in 10 years. Heating bills in January, who clears the driveway, who manages the insurance renewals, and whether the people receiving the gift can enjoy it without feeling secretly trapped by it. My parents could, because I had learned to ask a harder question than what would impress them. What would care for them? The answer turned out to be less flashy than people might expect. Wide doorways, fewer stairs, good storage, easy cleaning, solid systems. A porch designed for ordinary mornings. The emotional power came from the details, but the long-term peace came from the practical ones. And the stranger in the house, the thing that almost shattered the day, ended up proving the most important part of all. You can build a beautiful place and still miss someone entirely if you don't know the deeper map of their life. That morning, I thought I was protecting a surprise. Thomas's arrival showed me there was more to protect than secrecy. There was history. There were old versions of my parents I had never met. There were private memories attached to water, weather, youth, and longing. The house landed so deeply not because it was expensive, but because, somehow, it touched both their sacrifice and their beginning. Months later, I visited on a cold, bright morning and found my father in the kitchen making toast while my mother stood at the sink looking out over the water. Light fell exactly where I had hoped it would. She glanced at me and smiled. "This window," she said, "still gets me." I looked around at the quiet, the mugs, the folded blanket on the chair, the old photo now hanging in the hallway. And I understood something I hadn't fully seen while I was building it. The real gift was never the house alone. It was being known that, well, a few months after the anniversary, I asked my father if the house still felt real. He was on the screened porch when I said it, wearing an old thermal shirt and reading glasses. He only admitted needing in good humor. The morning fog had not fully lifted yet. It sat low over the cove in long white ribbons, and the porch screen held tiny beads of water that caught the light. My mother was inside humming softly while she made coffee. The sound carried through the open door with the smell of toast and cinnamon tea. My father looked out at the lake for a long second before answering. "No," he said. Then he smiled, but in a good way. That was probably the truest ending I could have hoped for, because the whole thing had felt unreal from the start. A passing comment on a chilly cabin deck, a private decision in a parked car, spreadsheets and permits and muddy boots, a budget that frightened me, a secret so large it started leaking around the edges, a finished lake house waiting in the trees like a held breath. And then, on the morning that was supposed to be simple, a stranger standing inside it with a photograph that turned the surprise into something deeper than I had planned. I built my parents a 3-100-and-20-5-1000 lake house for their 40th anniversary. That sentence sounds like the headline version, the polished version, the version people repeat because it is big and clean and dramatic. But living it was messier. It was calls taken from parking lots. It was changing line items at midnight and pretending muddy boots meant nothing. It was trusting contractors, revising plans, and wondering if love can accidentally become pressure when it gets expensive enough. It was trying to give my parents a future while not fully knowing I was also bringing them back to their beginning. And in the end, that stranger in the house was not there to take anything from us. He brought something back that still stays with me. So does the way my mother touched the sink window on the first day, like she was greeting a view she had been owed for years. So does the way my father looked at that old doc photograph and seemed to become younger for one impossible second. So does the way the house now holds ordinary life. Groceries on the counter, damp towels by the mudroom, family dinners that run long, grandchildren's shoes by the door, weather notes in my father's notebook, my mother reading in the chair by the glass. That is how a place becomes legacy. Not by being expensive, not by being rare, by being used with love. If you take anything from this, I hope it is not the price tag, I hope it is the pause. The moment where you think about the people who raised you, carried you, protected you, or simply kept showing up when life gave them every reason to become hard. So many people we love have dreams they stop saying out loud. Not because they stop wanting them, because they get busy surviving. They choose tuition over travel, medical bills over rest, repairs over beauty, everyone else first, the years do the rest. Sometimes the dream is a house by a lake. Sometimes it is much smaller. A porch, a trip, a repaired family photo, a reliable car, a weekend off, a garden they always wanted, a dining table big enough for everyone to come home to. The scale matters less than the seeing. That is the part I did not fully understand until all of this was over. Big gestures are powerful, yes. But the reason they land is because they answer a need most people never put into words clearly. They say, I noticed, I remembered, I know what you gave up, and if I can, I want to return some peace to you while you can still enjoy it. If you are ever in a position to build for someone you love, build with your eyes open, think beyond the reveal. Think about maintenance, ownership, taxes, repairs, and who carries what when the emotion settles. Beauty matters, so does durability, so does dignity. The most loving decision in the whole project may not be the dramatic one. It may be the unglamorous choice that makes the gift easy to live with for years. That was the real lesson hidden inside the mystery at the front door. I thought the biggest risk was someone ruining the surprise. It wasn't. The bigger risk would have been giving something beautiful without understanding the life it needed to hold. Now, whenever I drive out there and see the porch light come on at dusk, I think about all the versions of this story that could have happened. The one where I never acted. The one where the budget scared me off. The one where the house got built but never fit them. The one where Thomas never came. And a whole chapter of my parents' life stayed buried in an attic box. Instead, the house holds all of it, their sacrifice, their youth, their 40th year, their mornings now. And if you've stayed with me this far, I'd love to ask you one thing. What quiet dream would you want to give back to someone you love? Tell me in the comments. And if stories like this mean something to you, family, money, home building, hard choices, and twists nobody sees coming, stay with me. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.